It's a real honor and pleasure to introduce our next two speakers. I should mention that I was at the UN this fall, and some of you were here earlier today when I gave my talk, and I served as a delegate to the UN General Assembly, and there I met Ambassador Siv, who I'll tell you a little bit more about in a second. Your two speakers tonight are two outstanding Americans. Bill McCollum is a graduate of the University of Florida, born in Brooksville, Florida, not too far from here. He earned his law degree at the University of Florida and was president of Blue Key while he was there. A huge honor. University of Florida Hall of Fame also while he was there. He then, after graduation, served in the United States Navy from 1969 to 1972, and you know those were pretty tough years for the Navy, and Bill was there for us. He continued in the JAG Corps as he stayed in the Navy, and then he, for the last 20 years, has represented us in Congress. Bill served Central Florida at the United States Congress for 20 years. While he was there, he had positions of leadership in the area of banking, the judiciary, and a list of committees this long that I'm not going to bore you with, but Bill was an outstanding leader while he was in Congress as a congressman for us and did an outstanding job. He's currently with the firm of Baker and Hostetter, practicing federal policy in the federal policy area, and it's also serving the president as chairman of the Healthy Florida Foundation, and also on the board of directors of the James Madison Institute. And Bill has embarked, as of very recently, also on a race for Senate. So we certainly want to wish you the best, Bill, and then he'll be your first speaker. Second speaker is a gentleman that I got to know at the United Nations, and when I was up there, he serves as the U.S. ambassador to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. And let me just tell you a little bit about Sichan Siv. Sichan Siv was born in Cambodia, and his life was fairly uneventful when he went to law school in Cambodia. Then he decided he wanted to learn English, and he actually signed up to be a steward in an airline. And so he was an airline steward where he learned and secured his English, and that allowed him to get a job with CARE, the group that gives food and aid to people that need it. And so Ambassador Siv worked for CARE in Cambodia prior to the war breaking out. Then the war broke out with the Khmer Rouge, and many of you may have seen the movie Killing Fields, and you know the story of Cambodia. Ambassador Siv was a part of the group of CARE that was feeding the poor, and decided, well, he was advised that it would not be very good for folks that were aligned to the Americans to be there when the Khmer Rouge overran Phnom Penh. And so he was told there would be a helicopter coming for a group of them, and that he needed to be at a certain appointed place at a certain hour. Ambassador Siv decided that he would go and feed one more family at a village that, as he says, if he hadn't delivered that truck to them, they would have starved because of the war coming, etc. And so Ambassador Siv went and delivered that truckload of food to that community, and on the way back got caught to the point where he missed the helicopter by a half hour. So now he was caught in Cambodia in a hostile environment. He had three things going against him. He was tall, he wore glasses, and he liked America. And those three things were not very popular with the communist regime of the Khmer Rouge. First of all, tall meant that you were well fed, which meant that you were part of the bourgeois, and so that was not good for the communists. Secondly, glasses meant you were an intellectual, and that they were trying to purge the intellectuals out of the country. And thirdly, of course, the fact that he's associated with Americans was not good. When the Khmer Rouge overran Phnom Penh and took everybody out of the city into the fields, and you had to go to your ancestral villages, and they emptied out, as you know, maybe from that movie or read about the atrocities committed by the Khmer Rouge. Ambassador Siv hopped on a bike and worked his way through the country towards Thailand for 2 weeks, issuing himself some fake papers and telling me that sometimes the guards would read the paper upside down and tell him, okay, go on, etc. And so he worked his way to the Thai border and for 2 weeks. And when he was right close to the Thai border, they arrested him and took him to a killing field. His mother and brother did not survive the killing fields. Ambassador Siv then attempted to work in the killing fields in the logging crew. He was using a forklift, never seen a forklift before in his life, but he decided this is the way to get out of the camp, and so he learned how to work at forklift. And one day, as they were driving on the logging truck from the logging area back to the camp, he decided it was a day for him to slip away and see if he could escape. And so he got on top of the truck and went far, far, far back so that he could not be seen by the mirror. And as he jumped off the truck, his arm got caught in the sleeve on one of the logs, and the truck proceeded to drag him up and down this road and skid him. And as he sat there bouncing, he said he thought he'd come so far and just wasn't going to make it. Fortunately, the sleeve finally ripped, and he felt as the truck sped away and was able to work towards the fields. He was scraped and bruised pretty badly as he embarked on a 3-day trip down the jungles of Cambodia trying to find his way back to Thailand. He fell into a booby trap one night, and the booby trap was designed for a much shorter person, and had he been short, he would have been hit by the booby trap spikes right in the stomach. Instead, he got hit in the leg and hurt his leg very badly. But he continued to walk through that night, and after 3 days, he found himself in the Thai border. He was immediately, of course, arrested as an illegal immigrant and bounced around pretty badly by the Thai authorities, but he was very glad to be there. Ambassador Siv then went into a concentration camp, or not a refugee camp. And in that refugee camp, everyone's very depressed, as the story goes, and just very, very gloomy. And Ambassador Siv decided he needed to build the morale of these people, and so he started teaching English and changed the entire morale of that camp and was given credit for really turning that camp around. His friends from CARE found that he was there a few months later and were able to usher him out of the camp and found a sponsoring family in the United States to sponsor him. He came to live in the Northeast and started his jobs, of course, flipping hamburgers and working as a taxi cab driver, and then was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to Columbia University, where he received a master's degree. Ambassador Siv then had an opportunity when Cambodia was split into 3 after the peace was allowed, to serve as an ambassador for Cambodia at that time. And there were 3 ambassadors sharing the same office. And the other 2 ambassadors, one of them was for the group that represented the Khmer Rouge and the folks that took his family's life. So it was very difficult for him to share that room with him, but he did it with dignity as an ambassador should. President Bush 41, recognized his talents and invited him to work with him as a deputy assistant to the president for public liaison. And so Ambassador Siv, having become an American citizen, worked for the White House under the Bush administration and excelled while he was there. He then went on to work as a mortgage banker. And during this second administration of Bush, or George W. Bush, he was invited to become an ambassador to the United Nations. And today he sits as our ambassador at the United Nations, as our ambassador in charge of the Economic and Social Council and the General Assembly. And I can tell you that he's highly regarded not only by all the people in the United Nations crew, but as you walk to the United Nations, every person you walk by with Ambassador Siv will stop, shake his hand, pat him on the back, and he is a great, great asset for the United States to have as we try to build bridges in the United Nations. And so we're very fortunate to have someone like Ambassador Siv work for the United States. He recently coordinated the food program for Afghanistan and is now in charge of coordinating the food program for Iraq. And so, folks, we have 2 great Americans, in Bill McCollum and Ambassador Sichan Siv, one born in Brooksville and one born in Cambodia, both part of the American dream, and I'm very happy to have both of them share the podium with us.
I'll tell you, You ought to be applauding Ambassador Siv for that. I heard that story, and I had not heard all of that before. But I can tell you it's a great privilege to be on the podium with you. And I happen to have been on the Immigration Subcommittee for 18 of my 20 years in the U.S. House. And I remember going more than once to Thailand, to the border, to the refugee camps that were there when I was there. And I know quite a bit of the story of what had happened, but nothing like the first-hand experience. So I also know that Ralph was a little modest himself with the background that he's had, and his brother with Cuba. You are seeing here, besides me, I'm just up here today as a friendly native, so to speak, but you're seeing two people on this podium today who really understand what freedom means. The rest of us, including most of you in the audience, young people who are students here, have a appreciation from a distance. I understand more of it because I've served and I've been out and I've looked at the rest of the world, and I certainly hope and challenge you to do the same if you've not, and I doubt many of the younger people here have, who are students. But the fact is that none of us who are born in this country could ever appreciate the value of the freedoms we have as much as those who've immigrated here. And that's what's made this nation great. We are a nation of immigrants. We are a nation that blends together and can talk and speak the languages, if you will, in so many ways of the rest of the world. It's a special privilege to be here tonight with Lou Frey's Institute. Lou and I served in Congress, and we both know we didn't serve together, but we've served in the same area, representing this area. I've known him a long time. We understand the same language, so to speak, in that regard. And as I said, the very first one of these institutes, Lou, you are a terrific asset to this nation, not just this community, and we're mighty proud that you individually have done so much to make this possible here for the University of Central Florida. And I know that that pretty lady behind you named Marcia and your family who are here with you tonight make up that possibility too. So again, our tribute and our hats off to you. Let me speak very briefly about a little bit of this freedom, and then I'd like to hear, I'm looking forward to hearing Ambassador Siv. I almost feel like I shouldn't be here. I should be listening with you in the audience. I'm going to tell a story that some of you who were here in the last Institute session heard me tell. The rest of the talk is not the same by any means. I was asked to talk about Iraq, the war, moral or immoral, the United Nations. Predicating that little story I'm going to tell, I want to say up front that I'm not one of these people who believes the United Nations is a bad thing. I think it's a very positive thing. I've never and never would advocate that the United States leave the United Nations. I've heard some of my colleagues, former colleagues, say that, and I don't believe that for a minute. I think the United Nations does a lot of wonderful things, including especially the food programs, the humanitarian assistance, etc. But in a couple of minutes, I'll tell you why I think there are problems related to the United States' role today and its relationship to the UN regarding Iraq in particular. But before I get there, I want to let you know that I have strong commitments to continued support for the United Nations. With respect to the story, it's a true story about how I encountered former President of the United States, Richard Nixon. I did not know the man in office because I didn't serve in Congress till long after he had left office. In disgrace, as you may recall, from the famous Watergate incident. And I had met him one time prior to when I'm going to tell you about. I had gone as a part of the Republican leadership to a little reception, about 6 or 7 of us, at his hotel room in Washington once, and said hello and paid my respects. He had written me some notes during the time I was on the Iran-Contra Committee, which was a hearing series that some of the younger people in the audience wouldn't remember, but it took place in the 80s, and it was a very dramatic time in our history at that moment. But I didn't know him. And then in 1990, I think it was March 1990, he came to Washington to speak. To put that in context, I will tell you that the United States had been very much an aggressor in trying to help the Afghans throw the Soviets out of Afghanistan. And I had been interested in that for a similar reason that I was over in Thailand at the border. I was asked to assist and did assist in a major program to aid the Afghan refugees at that time in Pakistan in the late 1980s. And at any rate, President Nixon, former president, now late President Nixon, was aware of that as well. But the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in January or February of 1989. And in March of 1990, the president came to speak for the first public appearance in Washington since he left the White House. It was a talk to our House Republican Conference. And I went over and I heard him that morning, and I came back. I was very intrigued by it all because he was a figure that I didn't know well, but I knew of. Gave a great speech, known a lot for his foreign policy. And at my office when I got there was a little note that said, President Nixon would like you to come down to his hotel this evening and visit with him about Afghanistan. And I thought, wow, this is great. I'm going to go down. It'll be probably a little meeting, 6 or 7 of us again, a reception type thing. And I took my chief of staff and I went. Well, when I got there, I discovered that there wasn't anybody else there. It was just President Nixon and me and my chief of staff. And he put me down in a chair and put his feet up on a hassock, and he said, there are a few things that I needed to know as a leader for the 21st century. Now, this is not 2000 or 2001. This is 1990. And he said, Bill, you know, you need to know a lot of things, and he rattled off quite a few of them. But at the end of the day, the bottom line was, in his view, the communism was dead. This is before the fall of the Berlin Wall, not long, but before the fall. It's before the Soviet Union collapsed. And he's telling me communism's dead. The free market system's won. You're not going to have to worry about that in the next century. Our economic system will prevail, and it has won out. He also said China's not a problem. Now, that's not clear, but for the West, in his view, China was not an aggressive country, an expansionist country. Might have a little battle over Taiwan. They cared about hegemony in their region of the world, but that wasn't going to be a confrontational issue for us in foreign policy or for our security for the 21st century. He said there are 2 things you need to know for the 21st century. 2 things you're going to have to face, the United States, the West, you as a leader in that century to come. He said, number 1, you are going to have to figure out how the West raises the standard of living of the third world up to ours before they lower ours down to theirs. Now that sounds pretty textbookish and so forth, but it was very profound, and it had a direct relationship to the second thing he said. And after September the 11th of 2001, I know that many of us fully appreciate it much more than we did at the time he was saying it. That was 1. Number 2, he said to me, the other big thing that challenges the West and the United States and the free world in the 21st century is how you're going to deal with a rising tide of radical Muslim fundamentalism. And the word underscored is radical. Now, this wasn't, as I said, in 2000. It was 1990. I had founded the House Task Force on Terrorism in 1989, shortly after the experience that I'd had in dealing with the refugees in Pakistan, and the Soviets had withdrawn, because I could see from my dealings with the camps that were there in Pakistan were very anti-Western. And what was happening at that time is they prelude to the civil war that went on in Afghanistan afterwards. The Pakistani ISI, their intelligence community, were stirring up people. They had ideas on what they wanted to do. And we kind of got lost because it was about that time or shortly after that, to put this in context again, that we got into Desert Storm, the first confrontation with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And the United States sort of left it to the Pakistanis to deal with Afghanistan. And it became the mess that we know today. Those camps continued. And out of all of this came Al-Qaeda, and came Osama bin Laden, and came the terrorists that we know today. Not that they didn't predate that, and I'm not going into that history, but they were influenced greatly by this, and their ability to grow and to develop into the powerful force that they became enough to do what they did September the 11th occurred. Today, bringing it into context of the moment, Iraq is directly related to all of this. No, Saddam Hussein wasn't a terrorist in the sense of part of that. He wasn't a radical Muslim. But I am convinced that had we not gone into Iraq, sooner or later he would have provided biological or chemical weaponry to the terrorists to do dirty things against the West and us. He was a tyrant, enormously so, and we can see that more now even than we did before, when we see the mass graves that he did for his own people, and all the atrocities that he committed, human rights violations, much longer than the list this evening, if we started to write it, would compare. I am deeply of the belief that President Bush did the right thing by going into Iraq. Did he have the right information on there being a program of weapons of nuclear nature going on, or maybe going to go on in there? I don't know. Probably not, based on what we're hearing today. But it matters not whether they find a single weapon in Iraq today or ever find one. At one time or another, Saddam Hussein had them, he had the capability, he had the desire to utilize them, and he profoundly thumbed his nose and then some at the United Nations and all the efforts at weapons inspectors, whether it's the Clinton administration or the Bush administration or the UN completely. And the reality was we needed to do it. But the question today before us is not whether we should have gone in there so much as it is what do we do with it, or what is done with it. And should the United Nations determine that outcome, or should the United States determine it, or some combination of our allies? And I certainly believe that it would be preferable if we did have more of our European allies joined in this cause than are now. I thought it would have been preferable had we had them when we went in. But as you know, the battle between the United States and the French and the Russians, and to some extent the Germans on this issue, before the Security Council was not to be in times that we were prepared to, or in terms we were prepared to agree to, and consequently we moved, not completely unilaterally because we had allies in this, obviously, many countries joined us, but we moved without the blessing of the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council into Iraq. Today, we're in the aftermath of that. There's still feelings that are hurt about it, there's still questions about what do we do, but there are people who have fundamental differences of opinion about where we go from here, what we do, how we deal with that part of the world. For one, there are those who believe in this country, as well as in Europe and elsewhere, that we should be trying almost exclusively to contain the terrorist and to contain that part of the world rather than to try to change it. And then there are those who believe, as I do, that our duty and the requirement that President Nixon was talking about requires us to engage in an effort to change the area, the world, not to be like the West, but to change the conditions and the government structures so that there will be hope and opportunity for young people and generations to come, and the terrorists won't have a way to recruit as easily as they do now in the future. And that can only come about if Iraq and Afghanistan become examples for the rest of the region of what can be done in a more democratic fashion with government structures that allow an economy to grow that everybody can share and prosper and benefit from and participate in. It is not an easy thing to do. The short run, in my judgment, is that we have to disrupt the terrorists to keep them from being able to do what they did on September the 11th in this country and elsewhere. And that involves cutting off communication and finances and seeking out the heads of these groups and bringing them to justice, as President Bush would say. It involves a lot of international cooperation to do that, because the Muslim world, as you know, is very large, and the radicals plant their tentacles in Africa, the Middle East, the Near East, all the way to the Philippines. And Indonesia, as you know, is the largest Muslim population in the world. But it also involves American policy and an agreement on what that is. But that's the short run. That's what we have to do right now. The long run is, as Nixon said, we have to find a way to see the standard of living of the third world raise up towards ours. And that cannot be accomplished under the conditions that exist in much of the Arab and particularly the Muslim world today. And that is why it's so important, beyond our own immediate concern with respect to our own security from the standpoint of the terrorist, that these efforts succeed in Iraq and in Afghanistan, in the formations of these new infant governments. Finding ways, despite the disagreements among Shiites and Sunnis and the Kurds and all of the other factions that are involved in the tribal affairs in Afghanistan, whether it's the Taliban or the many other Mujahideen leaders whom I knew and the various factions that existed in that period of time to try to bring them together. And it would be preferable, again, to have the United Nations involved, not sitting on the sideline. On the other hand, the experience that we've had with the United Nations historically, not in the role of aid and in doing things for humanity, but in the role of trying to provide governance and security for situations that rank in some degree of comparability to this, that experience has been poor. One of the reasons, as Ralph is I'm sure well aware of it, at the General Assembly level you have countries of all persuasions. And it's important to have those voices, it's important to have the debate, it's important to have the discussions and be involved as much as you can. But many of those countries, of course, aren't free. And many of those countries don't agree with our policies. But at the end of the day, we would enjoy their participation to the degree we can. But we couldn't really expect to turn this over to them when you got so many, in fact the majority, who wouldn't agree with what we want to do in terms of making changes in Iraq for the long haul in the same way. The Security Council is another story. The French in particular and the Russians, not so much the Germans now, are a problem for us because they are members of the Security Council and they've really opposed us in terms of what we're doing, partly out of selfishness in my judgment. There are some provocative things I could say to you that I think are forces potentially behind that. I don't know for sure, but I suspect strongly that the fact that there is such a large debt owed by Iraq from the previous government to France and to Russia for arms sales, among other things, is a factor in this. My own judgment is that that debt ought to be done away with in order to give Iraq a fresh start, but naturally the French and the Russians aren't too excited about doing that. My own judgment is that if we are to see an understanding and an agreement, that there's going to have to be some accommodation of those concerns in the future, and that may be what's going on behind the scenes in those discussions today. I am the guy who sees the glass half full, not half empty. So I believe that at some point in the not too distant future, we will see the United States and all of its allies in Europe particularly join together in making these regime changes work. But in the short run, it is not continuing not to be easy. But it's vastly important because the end of this for you, the college students who are here and the next generation is going to be affected by this outcome. It's extraordinarily important. I don't think there's anything else we're doing that's going to be more important than the success of this. Freedom, as we know it today, cannot survive in a world of chaos and terrorism. And we don't want our children and our grandchildren to have to live with the overriding concerns that now they will unless these changes succeed. And so as we go through the next few months, the question of moral versus immoral was posed in the question to me. And I can tell you I think it is a moral imperative, not moral in the sense that we impose our moral values on that region of the world because the religious views, the cultural views are all different. They're going to remain that way, and no one here should try to change them. But because in the broadest sense of a moral imperative, it's critical for humanity, for human values, for human rights, for basic freedoms, for the opportunities of people to have economic chances in life that are greater than they have today, for an entire population that is extraordinarily large. And it's important in a moral sense for the United States, for this generation to be able, and the next generation, to be able to continue the freedom that Lou Frey's and mine and Ralph's generation have had. And it's very important to anyone who looks at this. So that's my perspective on it. I believe that, as I said to you a few moments ago, Ambassador Siv will have an enlightening thing or two to say, and I'm looking forward more to hearing him. But I did want to give you my perspective. I was invited to do so. I've given it, and I want to hear him say what he's going to say, and then I look forward to engaging in a discussion with you about the single most important issue of our generation, yours and mine, in this 21st century. Thank you.
Tonight, I just learned that the greatest challenge for an American ambassador is not so much to negotiate resolutions at the UN, but is to come to the podium and speak after Bill McCollum. The only excuse I have is that English is my third language. Thank you very much, Congressman Lou Frey, for bringing us together tonight, and I salute your leadership in Congress and also your legacy of setting up this important Institute of Politics and Government and this very distinguished University of Central Florida. I'm very happy to be back here in Orlando with Ralph and Becky, but also I'm even happier that my wife, Martha, also came along. I have had the greatest respect and admiration for Bill McCollum. When he was in Congress, he worked so hard helping refugees and immigrants, and as he mentioned, this is a country of refugees and immigrants. When we look around the room, we will see that we are all sons and daughters of refugees and immigrants. And Ralph is so modest. He came here, as you all know, when he was 12 years old, and he was able to mentor somebody to become Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. like Nick mentioned. So we all look at RAL as a beacon of freedom and also a symbol of what America is all about. One thing that I should mention, what Bill McCollum did was the House Task Force on Terrorism, which was quite an important work, and that was something that he thought of even terrorism before terrorism became the catchword, and I salute you for that, Bill. And we all can dream, and Robert H. Goddard once said that it is difficult to say what is impossible, because the dream of yesterday is the hope of today and the reality of tomorrow. So my dream tonight is that one day I'll go back for a Senate confirmation hearing, and then there was a senator from the Sunshine State of Florida who said, Mr. Chairman, I'm very happy to endorse a nominee. I didn't want to impose on you to join the Foreign Relations Committee, but it would be great. It would be great to hear you say that. I was with him at the panel at the University of Central Florida. He did a great job. Anyway, freedom, that's a key word. And President Bush, George W. Bush, once said, we propose our principles, but we must not impose our cultures. Yet, the basic principles of human freedom and dignity are universal. People should be able to say what they think, worship as they wish, elect those who govern them. It is with this idea that I carry my responsibility, that I carry out my duties at the United Nations. We have a lot of stories to tell. We are the leader, we are the largest leader, the largest donor to all United Nations humanitarian assistance programs. I have been given the responsibility of working on everything from cradle to coffin, from children to aging. In between, you have women, HIV/AIDS, health, refugees, human rights, and humanitarian assistance. I was sworn in November 10, 2001, 1 hour before President Bush came to speak to the General Assembly. That year, the General Assembly was supposed to begin on September 11, 2001, and after the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in Pennsylvania and the Pentagon, we postponed it for 2 months. The minute after I lowered my right hand, I spent about 60% of my time working on Afghanistan. And now you see that the country has changed, the society has changed. Women can go back to work to do their professional thing, being nurses, teachers, doctors, and so on and so forth. We are going to do the same thing for Iraq. The objectives for George W. Bush and this administration in Iraq are very simple. 3 things. One is to provide stability, security and stability to the country. Second is to promote prosperity. And third is to promote democracy. So it's security, stability, democracy. At this 58th session of the General Assembly, we have a few priorities. The United States is the only country that normally does 3 things before the GA. One is to send what we call démarches. Démarches are like just a series of points that we want to get across. We do démarches in all the capitals in the world where we have diplomatic relations, telling them about the points, the priorities, objectives, what we want to achieve during this session. Second thing is send somebody to a few selected countries. I was chosen to do that to about 10 countries, 1 day per capital. And third, sometime in July this year, it's July 29, the permanent representative of the United States, John Negroponte, sent dear colleagues letters to all the permanent representatives telling them about the priorities. First, why priorities? Because if everything is a priority, there's no priority. So let me cite these 5, 6 priorities. This is what I call double C, double H, W. The first C is cloning. Cloning, in the opinion of the United States, is an unethical and inhuman issue, and all human cloning should be banned. The Costa Rican delegation has proposed a draft resolution that we now have like 50 co-sponsors. This is a very large list of co-sponsors, and that includes 3 major members of the European Union, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. So the EU has no common position on this one. The second one is what I call, the second C is cyberspace security. As you know, cyberspace, internet is a very important component of our daily life. We want to make sure that it's very well protected, and we propose that the decision that has been adopted in Paris by the G8 Ministers of Interior and Justice be endorsed, that they have 11 principles that provide a protection of information infrastructure. So that's second C. The first H is HIV/AIDS. This is a major problem primarily in Africa and some Caribbean countries. The president has asked and obtained $15 billion to provide assistance to countries that have been heavily affected by AIDS. And this is a reflection of how caring and how compassionate our country is. And on the 22nd of September, there was a special session on HIV/AIDS, and Secretaries Powell and Tommy Thompson represented us there. And we wanted to make sure that the global fund for AIDS remained fully equipped to address this problem. The second H is human rights. Human rights is a major cornerstone of our foreign policy. We see the Commission of Human Rights eroding quite a bit with Libya as chairman and with Cuba as member of the Commission. And there are 54 members of the Human Rights Commission. About 20 of them are what I call the ugly. You remember the movie The Good and the Bad and the Ugly? The Commission of Human Rights, which was founded in 1944 with Eleanor Roosevelt as the first chairman for the first few years, now has more the ugly than the bad than the good. So that's not a way to reflect the spirit and the letter of the Commission. We don't want to have this turn into a commission of human rights abusers. Early in May, this year in May, for some reason, it's a complex rotational system, Cuba was re-elected. And I was in the U.S. seat, so I walked out to protest such a ridiculous action. And I walked out twice. Next time when the Cuban ambassador spoke, it was an outrage for us to see a country like human rights, which we, like Castro, Cuba, which we considered as the worst human rights violator in this hemisphere, to be a member of the Commission. W is women in politics. Women in politics is, we view that women have a very important role in society, educate women, bring up good families make up good societies. A case in point is, I just cited the example of Afghanistan and Iraq. And in the countries that I did my pre-UNGA consultation, one of them was Morocco. Morocco, as you know, is a modern Muslim country. It's now chairman of the G77, the group of 77. And they are quite active in women in parliamentary elections. In fact, we, the United States, with the National Endowment for Democracy, has been helping Morocco to promote women in politics. So this is a resolution, a draft resolution that the United States will propose. In my consultation, we have received a lot of support from other countries. Counter-terrorism, that's an issue that is going on, and we want to make sure that the countries that have not signed all the terrorism-related conventions be able to do so. And on the 23rd of September, President Bush raised another important issue, trafficking in people. 800,000 to 900,000 people are being smuggled every year This is another aspect of slavery. And we cannot accept that some member countries be sources or even supporting of this effort. So we are going to propose a way so that member countries make it a criminal action for those who are involved in people smuggling. So these are the things that we see is going on now, and I agree with Congressman Bill McCollum, soon to be Senator Bill McCollum, that this is a glass half full. Glass half full. On September 12, 2002, President Bush went to address the UN and urged the UN to be more relevant. Nothing has happened. And the United Nations needs to make itself a little bit more relevant with all the issues, not just all those good stories that I've been telling you, all the good stories that the United States is the leader. It is quite a mixed picture. You see the General Assembly, 191 countries. The United States has been paying now 22% of the budget. We have only one vote. St. Lucia, which pays 0.00002% of the budget, also has one vote. And also, at the moment, the president of the GA is from St. Lucia. So the fact is clear that everybody has one vote, but in the private sector, the more shares you have, the more votes you have. You can influence the position, but it's still a very useful forum for people to share and to consult. And of course, the Security Council has been set up that way to have 5 permanent members with veto powers. And the Economic and Social Council has been set up that way to have 54, mostly the countries that have the largest economies, United States, Japan, United Kingdom, and so on and so forth. So putting all of this together, I think it's still very, very useful for us to be there. We help found the United Nations. So we are multilateralists. We want to make sure that everybody has a voice, but that doesn't mean that the largest number can be silenced. The largest number has to be able to have a say also. So every day is a challenge, and I am very pleased to represent you, to represent the United States at the United Nations. Each time I walked in, they looked at me. Through me, they see America. They see the promises that America has to offer. They see you, they see your neighbors. Through me, they wanted to hear what I have to say. And the minute I say, on behalf of the United States, the room becomes quiet. And that is my proudest moment. Thank you.